Chapter 1. The Silence I Was Afraid of. The apartment was quieter than I expected. Not the kind of quiet that comes late at night when everyone is asleep, but a deeper one. A quiet that felt intentional, chosen. The lights were on, the windows were closed, and yet the room felt empty in a way I wasn't used to. I stood near the door for a moment, holding my keys, listening. Nothing. No voices from another room, no phone ringing, no television filling the space with sound I didn't care about, just the low hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. I walked inside and placed my bag on the floor. The sound it made echoed slightly, then disappeared. I looked around the apartment as if I were seeing it for the first time. The couch, the table, the chair by the window. All familiar, all quiet. Usually, I filled moments like this quickly. Music, a podcast, messages, anything to break the silence before it had time to settle. But this time, I didn't. I sat down slowly on the couch and rested my hands on my knees. The cushions sank under my weight, and the room adjusted around me. The silence stayed. It felt heavy. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. I noticed how my body reacted to it. My shoulders tightened. My thoughts began to move faster, as if they were looking for something to hold on to. I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable without knowing why. I wasn't sad. I wasn't anxious. I was unused to this, being alone without distraction. No one expecting a reply, no conversation waiting to be continued, no background noise to tell me time was passing. Just me. I glanced at my phone on the table. It was within reach. I could end this feeling in seconds. I could scroll, I could listen, I could disappear into other people's voices. Instead, I left it where it was. The silence grew clearer. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to experience it, how often I filled every empty space with something else, something safer. The quiet didn't judge me. It didn't ask anything. It waited. My thoughts drifted to a sentence I had never said out loud, but had believed for a long time. I thought being alone meant I was losing connection, losing importance, losing something I was supposed to have by now. I had seen it everywhere, people surrounded by friends, couples filling rooms with laughter, lives that looked full and busy and shared. Alone felt like the opposite of that. Alone felt like failure. I sat there and let that belief surface fully. I didn't push it away. I didn't soften it. I thought about how often I avoided evenings like this, how I scheduled my time carefully so I wouldn't have to face an empty room, how I agreed to things I didn't really want just to avoid being by myself. I had told myself I liked being busy. Now I wondered if I was just afraid of quiet. The room felt bigger as the minutes passed. The walls didn't close in. They stayed where they were. It was my attention that felt exposed. Without noise, I could hear my thoughts more clearly. Small ones, ordinary ones. Did I make the right choices? Why does this feel uncomfortable? What am I supposed to do now? There were no answers waiting, and that made me uneasy. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights glowed softly. A few cars passed, their headlights moving through the darkness. Other lives, other directions. I watched them without envy, without longing, just noticing. The silence followed me to the window. It didn't change shape. It didn't demand explanation. It simply existed. I realized how much effort I usually put into not being alone with myself, how many years I spent thinking strength meant being surrounded, being needed, being connected at all times. But standing there, looking out into the quiet street, I felt something else beneath the discomfort. Curiosity. What if this silence wasn't empty? What if it was just unfamiliar? I went back to the couch and sat down again. This time, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The room didn't disappear. It became more real. I noticed my breathing. Slow, steady. I noticed the weight of my body against the cushion, the way my feet rested on the floor. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet something shifted. I wasn't losing anything in this moment. I wasn't being left behind. I was simply here. The fear I had carried about being alone began to look different, less like truth, more like habit, something I had learned, not something I had chosen. I had learned that silence meant emptiness, but sitting there, I didn't feel empty. I felt unoccupied. There was a difference. I thought about all the times I equated being alone with being unwanted, all the moments I filled space just to feel relevant. This moment asked nothing of me, and for the first time, that didn't feel like a threat. The silence didn't disappear as the evening went on. It stayed, steady, neutral. I turned on a small lamp. The light softened the room. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't reach for my phone. I stayed. I noticed that the discomfort began to fade, not because I escaped it, but because I let it be. The silence wasn't trying to take anything from me. It was giving me space. Space to notice how tired I was. Space to notice how much noise I had relied on. Space to notice myself. I didn't suddenly feel strong. I didn't feel peaceful in a perfect way, but I felt honest. The fear of being alone was still there, faint but present. It didn't disappear in one evening, but it changed. It no longer felt like proof of failure. It felt like the beginning of something I didn't understand yet. As the night grew quieter, I remained where I was. The apartment felt less empty now, not because something filled it, but because I stopped running from it. I thought again about the belief I had carried for so long. I thought being alone meant I was losing. Sitting there in the silence, I realized something simple. Maybe being alone didn't mean losing at all. Maybe it was standing still enough to see what was actually there. And for the first time, I didn't turn away from that thought. I stayed with it, in the quiet. Chapter 2. When being alone felt like failure. The feeling followed me into the next days. It didn't announce itself. It moved quietly, hiding behind ordinary moments. I noticed it when I walked past cafes filled with voices and laughter, when I saw groups of people standing close together, talking easily, sharing something I wasn't part of. I told myself I didn't mind, but I did. There was a message I had absorbed without questioning it, a message repeated everywhere, even when no one said it directly. Connection meant success. Being surrounded meant you were doing life right. Noise meant you mattered. Alone felt like the opposite of all of that. I saw it in small ways, social media posts filled with dinners, celebrations, shared weekends, people smiling next to other people, lives that looked full, busy, supported. I scrolled and told myself I was just passing time. But comparison had already begun. I counted things I wasn't doing, people I wasn't with, moments I wasn't sharing. I measured my quiet evenings against their crowded ones. Every time, my life came up short. I began to notice how carefully I spoke when people asked me about my plans. I avoided saying I would spend the weekend alone. I added extra words, explanations, reasons. I'm just taking some time. I'm catching up on things. I didn't say the truth. I'm alone. That word felt heavy in my mouth, like something to defend against. I wondered when being alone had started to feel like something I needed to justify. No one had told me directly that it was wrong, but everything around me suggested it. The stories we celebrate, the images we share, the idea that happiness is loud and shared and visible. I looked at my own life and felt like it was paused while everyone else was moving forward. Everyone else seemed surrounded. I was standing still. The sentence stayed with me. It felt true in a way I couldn't ignore. Standing still meant falling behind. Standing still meant being forgotten. Or so I believed. I noticed how shame crept in quietly, not sharp or dramatic, just enough to make me doubt myself. What's wrong with you? Why are you alone? Did you do something wrong? I didn't have answers. I only had the feeling that I was missing something essential. I tried to fix it in small ways. I accepted invitations I didn't really want. I filled my schedule with things that looked social, even when they left me more tired than before. I told myself it was better than being alone. But the shame didn't disappear. It followed me into rooms full of people. It sat beside me in conversations where I smiled but felt distant. It whispered that I didn't belong the way others did. I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of what being alone said about me. That fear shaped how I saw myself. I questioned my worth, my timing, my choices. I wondered if I had missed something important earlier in life, a turn I was supposed to take, a path I failed to follow. I didn't think of my life as unfinished. I thought of it as behind. That belief weighed on me more than the silence ever had. One afternoon, I sat in a park and watched people pass by. Families, couples, friends walking side by side. I felt invisible. Not because anyone ignored me, but because I believed I wasn't seen. I compared my stillness to their movement and assumed movement was better. I didn't consider that some of them might feel just as alone, even surrounded. I only saw what I wanted to see, proof that I was failing. The shame grew stronger when I talked to myself in quiet moments. Why don't you have what they have? Why aren't you further by now? Those questions didn't come from curiosity. They came from judgment. I judged myself by a standard I never chose. A standard that said life should be shared at all times, that being alone meant something was missing. I believed it so deeply that I never stopped to ask if it was true. At night, when the apartment was quiet again, the feeling returned. The same silence as before, but now layered with doubt. I sat with it, aware of how uncomfortable it felt. Not because I was lonely, but because I felt exposed. Without others around me, I couldn't hide from the belief that I wasn't enough on my own. That belief hurt more than the quiet ever could. I realized how much of my self-worth I had tied to presence, to being chosen, to being included. Alone felt like rejection, even when no one had rejected me. The shame didn't shout, it sighed. It made me smaller in my own mind. I saw now how comparison fed it, how easily I looked at others and decided I was losing without knowing their full stories. I had been writing a story about myself that wasn't fair, but I didn't know how to stop yet. All I knew was that being alone felt heavy because I had learned to see it as failure. Not rest, not space, not choice. Failure. That belief shaped how I moved through the world. It explained my fear of quiet, my need for distraction, my discomfort with stillness. I wasn't trapped by loneliness. I was trapped by meaning. As I sat there in the fading light, I didn't try to change how I felt. I didn't tell myself to be positive or grateful. I just noticed the weight of the belief I was carrying. That belief was not neutral. It was hurting me. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I questioned it. Not rejected it, just questioned it. The thought stayed with me as the day ended. Being alone felt like failure. But maybe that feeling wasn't truth. Maybe it was something I learned. And if it was learned, it could be unlearned. I didn't know how yet, but I felt the beginning of a crack. Small, quiet, enough to let a little light in. Chapter 3. The exhaustion of always needing someone. When I thought about my past relationships, I didn't remember the beginnings first. I remembered the effort, the careful listening, the constant adjusting, the way I learned to read moods before they were spoken, the way I changed small parts of myself to keep things smooth. I had been good at it. Too good. I remembered how I showed up early, stayed late, answered quickly, how I filled silence with words so no one would feel uncomfortable, how I agreed even when I didn't fully agree, smiled even when I felt unsure. I told myself this was love, friendship, connection. And maybe it was, in part, but it was also exhausting. I thought about one relationship after another, different people, same pattern. I was always present, always available, always careful not to disappoint. I rarely asked myself what I wanted. I asked what was needed. At the time, it felt right. Being needed gave me direction. Being wanted gave me proof that I mattered. When someone was with me, I felt steady. When they weren't, I felt uneasy. I had mistaken presence for security. Looking back, I realized how little space I gave myself to be quiet, to be uncertain, to be alone with my own thoughts. Every gap was filled with someone else's voice. Phone calls, messages, plans, noise. I told myself I enjoyed it, but now, sitting alone in my quiet apartment, I felt something I hadn't named before. Relief. Not happiness. Relief. I remembered how tired I used to feel after spending time with people I cared about, not because they were difficult, but because I was constantly performing a version of myself. The version that was easy to like. The version that didn't ask for too much. The version that stayed agreeable. I hadn't noticed how heavy that version was until I put it down. I thought about moments when I wanted to be alone but didn't allow myself to be. How quickly I felt guilty for needing space. How I explained my absence instead of honoring it. I was afraid that if I stepped back, I would lose connection, so I stayed, even when I was tired, even when I was empty, even when I needed quiet. I didn't realize how much energy that took from me. The exhaustion wasn't physical, it was deeper than that. It lived in my chest and shoulders, in the way I sighed without noticing, in the way I felt drained without understanding why. I had blamed sadness, but now I saw the truth. I wasn't sad, I was exhausted. Exhausted from always needing someone to fill the space where my own voice should have been. I remembered times when plans were canceled and I felt panic before relief. The panic came first because I didn't know what to do with myself. The relief came later, quiet and guilty. I had been afraid of those moments, afraid of what would surface if I had no one to focus on. Sitting alone now, I understood. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of hearing myself. The sentence formed clearly in my mind, and when it did, it felt honest. When I was with others, my thoughts stayed busy. My attention stayed outward. I didn't have to listen too closely to my own feelings. Alone, there was no escape. My thoughts spoke freely. My doubts surfaced. My needs asked to be noticed. No one else could soften them or distract me from them. That was what I had been avoiding. I thought about how often I asked others how they were, but rarely asked myself the same question seriously. How easily I supported other people's emotions while ignoring my own. Being alone removed that option, and that was uncomfortable, but also revealing. I began to see solitude differently, not as absence, but as exposure to myself. The exhaustion I felt wasn't proof that I needed more people, it was proof that I needed more honesty. I needed space where I didn't have to adjust, explain, or perform. I needed to hear my own voice without interruption. That realization didn't make me suddenly brave, it made me quiet. I felt a soft sadness for the version of myself who believed connection required constant effort, who believed love meant self-erasure, who believed being alone was something to fix. I wasn't angry at that version. I understood them. They were trying to feel safe. They were trying to belong. They didn't know another way. I sat with that understanding and felt something shift. The fear of solitude loosened slightly. If being alone meant hearing myself, maybe that wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was an invitation. An invitation to rest. An invitation to listen. An invitation to stop reaching outward for validation I hadn't given myself. I thought about how many relationships had ended because I was tired, but didn't know how to say it. How many connections felt heavy because I didn't know how to create boundaries. I wasn't bad at relationships. I was bad at being with myself. That truth felt sharp, but it also felt fair. The exhaustion I carried had a reason, and reasons can be addressed. As the evening deepened, I noticed how calm the apartment felt. The silence no longer pressed against me. It rested beside me. I didn't feel lonely. I felt tired in a good way. The kind of tired that comes after finally telling the truth. I leaned back and closed my eyes, listening not to the room, but to myself. The thoughts came slowly now, without urgency. They weren't asking me to change everything. They were asking me to notice. Notice how much I had given. Notice how little space I had taken. Notice how solitude might not be my enemy. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. It hadn't changed, but I had. The fear that once lived in the silence had softened. It hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt threatening. I understood something important. The exhaustion of always needing someone was not proof of weakness. It was proof that I had been strong for too long without rest. Being alone was not something I needed to escape. It was something I needed to learn. And that learning had already begun. Quietly, without pressure, without an audience. Just me sitting still enough to hear myself. For the first time, that didn't feel like something to fear. It felt the beginning of understanding. Chapter 4. Learning to sit with myself. I decided to try something that felt small but frightening. I turned my phone off. Not silent, not face down, off. The room changed immediately, not because anything new appeared, but because nothing interrupted it anymore. No vibration, no screen lighting up, no excuse to look away. I sat at the table and folded my hands together, unsure what to do with them. The chair felt harder than usual. The air felt closer. This time, being alone was not an accident. It was intentional. I noticed how quickly my body reacted. My leg bounced, my fingers tightened, my mind searched for something familiar to grab onto. Noise, distraction, anything. But there was nothing. So I stayed. The first thoughts that came were shallow and restless. Lists, tasks, things I should remember to do later. I let them pass without following them. Then the quieter thoughts arrived. Memories I hadn't asked for. A conversation I replayed too often. A moment when I said yes instead of no. A time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I shifted in my chair, uncomfortable. This was the part I usually avoided. Without distractions, old emotions surfaced. Not dramatic ones, not overwhelming, just unresolved. Disappointment I never named. Anger I softened into politeness. Needs I buried under responsibility. They didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, like guests who had been waiting a long time. I felt the urge to stand up, to move, to escape the stillness. Instead, I took a breath and stayed where I was. Learning to sit with myself felt nothing like peace at first. It felt raw. I remembered relationships where I worked so hard to be understood that I forgot to understand myself. Times when I measured my worth by how useful I was to others. I saw how often I made myself smaller to avoid conflict, how easily I adapted, how rarely I rested. I had called it kindness, but sitting there, I recognized the cost. The exhaustion wasn't emotional sadness, it was depletion. I had poured myself outward for years without refilling anything inside. That truth sat heavily in my chest. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of hearing myself. The sentence returned, clearer now. Hearing myself meant hearing what I needed, what I wanted, what I had ignored. And that required honesty. Honesty without performance. Honesty without someone else there to soften it. My thoughts moved deeper. They became slower, heavier, more real. I thought about moments when I felt relief when plans were canceled, followed immediately with guilt. I thought about how often I felt tired, even when nothing was wrong. I had blamed life, but the truth was quieter. I was tired of leaving myself out of my own life. The realization stung, not because it was painful, but because it was accurate. I sat longer. Minutes passed. I didn't check the time. I didn't reach for anything. The discomfort didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It softened. I noticed how my breathing slowed when I stopped fighting the feeling, how the tension in my shoulders eased slightly when I allowed the thoughts to exist without judgment. This wasn't peace, but it was real. I realized how often I confused comfort with avoidance, how quickly I filled silence to prevent discomfort. Sitting with myself required patience I hadn't practiced. It required staying when it would be easier to leave. I remembered conversations where I nodded instead of speaking, relationships where I adjusted my needs to match someone else's rhythm. I saw now that solitude was showing me what connection had hidden, not the good parts, the neglected parts, the parts that needed space to speak. I felt tired again, but differently this time, not drained, honest. I stood up and walked slowly around the room. My movements were unhurried. I touched the back of the chair, the edge of the table, grounding myself in the present. This was my space. No expectations lived here. I returned to the couch and sat down, leaning back. The room felt quieter than before, but not empty. Full. Full of things I had avoided. Full of truths I was finally listening to. I realized something important in that moment. Solitude wasn't creating these thoughts, it was revealing them. They had always been there, waiting beneath the noise. I thought about how many years I spent believing strength meant staying connected at all times, being reachable, being agreeable. But sitting alone, without anyone watching, I felt a different kind of strength begin to form. The strength to stay, to listen, to not run. I didn't solve anything that night. I didn't make decisions. I didn't forgive or release or transform. I simply stayed present. That was enough. As the evening grew later, I noticed how the room felt calmer, not because my thoughts had stopped, but because I stopped resisting them. I turned the phone back on eventually, but I didn't pick it up right away. I let it sit where it was. For the first time, the silence didn't scare me. It challenged me. And challenges don't always need to be defeated. Sometimes they need to be understood. I went to bed feeling tired but grounded. My mind wasn't racing. My heart wasn't heavy. It felt settled. Learning to sit with myself didn't give me answers. It gave me permission. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to rest without explanation. Permission to exist without performance. I understood now that solitude wasn't something to fear or escape. It was something to practice, a skill, a relationship with myself that I had never fully developed. And like any relationship, it required time, patience, and honesty. That night, as I lay in the dark, the silence returned once more. But this time, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a quiet companion, one that wasn't asking me to be anything other than present. I closed my eyes and stayed with it. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing. I felt like I was learning how to stay. Chapter 5. The quiet night I stopped running. The night arrived without ceremony. No messages, no missed calls, no plans waiting to be confirmed. The apartment settled into itself as the city outside slowed down. Streetlights glowed steadily, and the sounds from earlier, cars, voices, movement, faded into something distant and low. I noticed how unusual that felt. Usually there was at least one reason to stay alert. Someone might need me, something might happen. Even when nothing did, I kept myself prepared for it. This night asked nothing. I sat on the couch with the lamp on low. The room felt smaller than usual, not because it had changed, but because there was nowhere to hide. No screen to stare into, no conversation to lean on, no noise to keep me company. I felt the familiar urge to escape. I could turn something on, I could reach out to someone, I could fill the space before it had time to settle. Instead, I stayed. The stillness pressed in gently. Chapter 5. The quiet night I stopped running. The night arrived without ceremony. No messages, no missed calls, no plans waiting to be confirmed. The apartment settled into itself as the city outside slowed down. Streetlights glowed steadily, and the sounds from earlier, cars, voices, movement, faded into something distant and low. I noticed how unusual that felt. Usually there was at least one reason to stay alert. Someone might need me, something might happen. Even when nothing did, I kept myself prepared for it. This night asked nothing. I sat on the couch with the lamp on low. The room felt smaller than usual, not because it had changed, but because there was nowhere to hide. No screen to stare into, no conversation to lean on, no noise to keep me company. I felt the familiar urge to escape. I could turn something on, I could reach out to someone, I could fill the space before it had time to settle. Instead, I stayed. The stillness pressed in gently at first. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't overwhelm me. It simply existed, steady and patient. I leaned back and closed my eyes. My mind did what it always did when given the chance. It searched, it replayed, it questioned. Small worries rose to the surface. Old conversations tried to finish themselves. Half-formed thoughts asked to be noticed. I let them come. For a while, I felt restless. My body shifted without purpose. My hands opened and closed. My breathing felt shallow, like I was waiting for something to interrupt the moment. Nothing did. I realized how much of my life had been spent running from this exact feeling, the feeling of not being needed, the feeling of being unreachable, the feeling of standing still while the world moved on without checking in. I had told myself I liked being busy. Now I saw the truth. I liked being distracted. The quiet asked me to be present in a way I wasn't used to. Present with my thoughts, present with my emotions, present with the simple fact of being here, alone. A wave of sadness moved through me, not sharp, not overwhelming, just real. It wasn't attached to any single memory or regret. It was broader than that. It was the sadness of noticing how tired I had been. Tired of staying connected out of fear, tired of being available to avoid discomfort, tired of confusing movement with meaning. I felt my throat tighten slightly, my eyes stung, not enough to cry, but enough to feel the weight of it. I didn't push it away. I stayed. For the first time, I didn't try to fix the feeling or explain it. I didn't label it or turn it into a problem. I let it pass through me. Minutes went by. I didn't count them. Time felt softer without the pressure of attention. My breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. The urge to escape faded. In its place came something quieter. Acceptance. I was here. No one was calling. No one was asking. No one was expecting anything from me. And that was okay. I realized how rarely I allowed myself to exist without purpose, how often I believed my value came from response, presence, participation. This night offered none of that. And yet, I was still here, still whole, still enough. The thought surprised me. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. The lamp cast a warm circle of light on the floor. The walls held their shape. The space felt grounded. Nothing was missing. I was just unused to stillness. The realization arrived gently, without force. It didn't feel like a breakthrough or a revelation. It felt like recognition. I had mistaken silence for emptiness, stillness for lack, aloneness for absence. But sitting there, I felt complete. Not happy in a loud way, not fulfilled in a dramatic sense, complete in a quiet, steady way. I remembered all the times I filled nights like this with something else, how I avoided the quiet because I thought it would expose something broken. But nothing was broken. There was just space. Space I hadn't learned how to sit in yet. I let my head rest against the back of the couch. My body felt heavy in a comforting way, like it finally had permission to stop holding itself together. I didn't need to be strong in that moment. I didn't need to be productive. I didn't need to be connected. I just needed to be. The quiet night didn't give me answers. It didn't give me direction. It didn't promise change. It gave me rest. Rest from the need to run. Rest from the belief that being alone meant being left behind. Rest from the constant effort of managing how I was seen. I stayed there until the night deepened. The room grew darker. The city outside felt farther away. I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. Eventually, I stood up and turned off the lamp. The silence settled around me without fear. I moved slowly, intentionally, as if I didn't want to disturb the calm. When I lay down in bed, the silence returned once more. This time, It felt familiar, almost welcome. I breathed deeply and let my body sink into the mattress. My thoughts moved slowly now, without urgency or demand. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't chasing connection or filling space. I was here, alone, and at peace with it. As sleep approached, the realization stayed with me, gentle and steady. Nothing was missing. I had simply never allowed myself to stop long enough to see that. The quiet night didn't change my life. It changed how I stood in it. And that was enough. Chapter 6. Understanding the difference between alone and lonely. The understanding didn't arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, like light entering a room through a small opening. I noticed it in moments that used to confuse me. Times when I was surrounded by people but felt distant. Times when my phone was full of messages, yet I felt unheard. Times when noise filled the space, but something inside me stayed empty. That was loneliness. Loneliness wasn't about being by myself. It was about being disconnected from myself. I had confused the two for years. I believed alone and lonely were the same thing. I believed silence meant lack. I believed quiet meant something was wrong. But sitting with myself changed that belief. I thought about how often I felt lonely in company, how many conversations I had where I nodded and smiled while my thoughts drifted away, how many times I felt pressured to be interesting, useful, agreeable. I was present in body, absent in spirit. That was loneliness. Lonely moments were loud. They needed distraction. They needed validation. They needed constant movement to keep discomfort away. Alone moments were different. Alone moments didn't ask for attention. They didn't demand explanation. They allowed me to exist without performance. That difference mattered. I started paying attention to how my body responded in each state. When I felt lonely, my chest tightened. My thoughts raced. I reached outward without thinking. I searched for something to fill the space. When I was alone, truly alone, my breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. My mind settled. Alone felt grounded. Lonely felt restless. I had spent years treating restlessness as a signal to seek people, noise, connection. I believed that meant strength. Now I saw the truth. Loneliness needed noise. Strength needed quiet. The sentence came to me one morning as I sat at the table, drinking coffee in silence. No phone, no music, just the sound of the cup against the table and the faint hum of the room. I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. I realized how much of my discomfort in the past came from expectations. Expectations about who I should be, how my life should look, how much connection I should have. Being alone removed those expectations. There was no one to impress, no role to play, no image to maintain. Just me. And that was enough. I stopped blaming circumstances for how I felt. I stopped telling myself loneliness came from not having enough people around. Loneliness came from not listening to my needs, not listening to my limits, not listening to my own voice. Being alone gave me space to listen again. I thought about how often I had judged myself for wanting solitude, how quickly I labeled it as avoidance or weakness. But solitude wasn't hiding. It was honesty. Honesty without an audience. I understood then that being alone didn't mean rejecting others. It meant not being pulled by their expectations. It meant choosing my own rhythm. I didn't feel angry at my past self for confusing the two. I felt understanding. I had been taught to fear quiet, to fill space, to believe value came from interaction. Those beliefs were learned, and anything learned can be questioned. I noticed how my sense of responsibility shifted when I stopped blaming others or circumstances. I didn't think, if only I had more people around, I'd feel better. I thought, if I stay connected to myself, I can be anywhere. That was empowering. Not in a loud way, in a calm one. I still enjoyed connection. I still valued relationships. I still felt joy in shared moments, but I no longer needed them to feel complete. Alone was no longer a problem to solve. It was a state to understand. I saw how loneliness had once driven my choices, how it kept me talking when I needed silence. Understanding the difference gave me responsibility without blame. I wasn't broken. I was just listening to the wrong signals. Loneliness asks for distraction. Aloneness offered clarity. One evening, I took a walk alone as the sun set. The sky shifted colors slowly, and the air felt cool against my skin. People passed me on the sidewalk, talking, laughing, moving together. I didn't feel left out. I felt steady. I realized that strength didn't come from constant connection. It came from being able to stand quietly with myself, to hear my thoughts without fear, to feel my emotions without rushing to change them, to accept my pace without comparison. That acceptance didn't isolate me. It grounded me. I understood now that loneliness wasn't cured by people. It was cured by presence. Presence with myself first. From there, everything else made sense. As I returned home that night, the apartment greeted me with the same quiet it always had. But the quiet felt different now. It felt familiar, welcoming, not empty. I placed my keys on the table and stood still for a moment, listening to the space around me. The silence didn't ask me to fill it. It asked me to be. I smiled, not because something exciting had happened, but because something important had settled. I finally understood what I had been afraid of all along. It wasn't being alone. It was misunderstanding what alone truly meant. Now that I did, the fear was gone. In its place was something stronger, clarity. And with that clarity came peace, quiet, steady, and mine. Chapter 7. Strength that no one applauds. My life didn't become impressive. It became quieter. Mornings arrived without urgency. I woke up without reaching for my phone. There were no messages waiting, no updates to check, no proof to collect that I was doing life correctly. At first, that silence felt unfamiliar. Then, it felt honest. My days slowed down in ways I never imagined would matter. I ate when I was hungry, not when it was convenient. I rested without explaining myself. I walked without a destination, letting my thoughts come and go without chasing them. Nothing about my life looked remarkable from the outside, and yet I felt stronger than I ever had. There was no audience for this version of me, no one to applaud the choices I made quietly, no one to validate the progress that didn't come with visible results. That used to scare me. Now it steadied me. I realized how much of my old strength was performative, how often I pushed through exhaustion because someone might be watching. how often I held myself together because I thought that was what strength looked like. But this strength felt different. It didn't require effort. It didn't demand proof. It didn't ask to be seen. I noticed it in small moments, in how I handled disappointment without spiraling, in how I sat with uncertainty without reaching for distraction, in how I allowed myself to change my mind without guilt. There was power in not explaining myself anymore, power in not needing to justify my pace. I stopped measuring my days by productivity and started noticing how I felt moving through them. Some days were slow, some days were quiet, some days passed without anything worth reporting, and that was okay. I no longer needed my life to look full to feel fulfilled. There was a calm that settled into my body, one that didn't come from achievement or recognition. It came from alignment, from living in a way that felt true, even if it went unnoticed. I thought about how often I once equated strength with endurance, how proud I was of surviving things I should have rested through, how much energy I spent proving I could handle everything. Now, I let things be easier. That didn't make me weaker, it made me clearer. I became more selective with my time, more protective of my energy, more honest about what I wanted and what I didn't. I stopped saying yes out of fear of being forgotten. I stopped filling my calendar just to feel important. I started trusting that my worth didn't disappear when I was quiet. There were moments when the old voice returned, the one that asked if I was falling behind, if I was missing out, if I was becoming invisible. But that voice was softer now, and I didn't obey it anymore. I noticed how my body responded when I lived this way. My shoulders stayed relaxed, my breath felt deeper, my thoughts moved slower, with more space between them. I wasn't rushing toward anything, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to. I felt strong without being seen. That sentence surprised me when it formed in my mind. Strength without witnesses, strength without evidence, just quiet resilience. I understood then that real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists. I thought of all the people who would never know how much I had changed, all the moments that passed without acknowledgement, all the choices that went unnoticed, and I felt peace, because those choices were mine. I no longer lived for reaction. I lived for resonance, for the internal sense of rightness that came from choosing myself again and again, even when no one noticed, especially when no one noticed. My life became simpler, not smaller. The simplicity created room for presence, for awareness, for gratitude that wasn't forced or performative. I enjoyed things quietly, a warm cup of coffee, a walk at dusk, a deep breath that reached places in my chest I didn't know were tense. I stopped chasing intensity and found steadiness instead. This version of strength didn't make noise, it didn't impress, it didn't demand attention, but it held. It held me when days felt uncertain. It held me when doubt whispered. It held me when old habits tried to return, and it didn't collapse under pressure. I realized that applause had never made me stronger. Stillness did. Self-trust did. The courage to be alone with myself and not run did. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore, not to the world, not to my past, not even to myself. I had nothing to defend, nothing to hide, nothing to perform. As the days continued, I noticed how this quiet strength shaped my interactions. I listened more. I spoke less. I chose honesty over approval. I didn't rush to fill silences in conversation. I didn't rush to fix discomfort. I allowed things to unfold at their own pace. There was dignity in that restraint. I once believed strength looked like pushing forward no matter what. Now I knew it also looked like stopping, pausing, choosing peace over noise. One evening, I sat by the window as the city lights flickered on. Cars moved below, people hurried past, conversations drifted up from the street. The world was busy. I wasn't. And for the first time, that difference didn't make me feel separate. It made me feel grounded. I placed my hand on the glass and breathed slowly. The reflection looking back at me felt steady, present, unafraid. I didn't need anyone to see this moment. I felt stronger without being seen. And that strength stayed with me, quiet and constant, long after the night settled in. It didn't ask for applause. It didn't need permission. It simply existed. Chapter 8. I found strength in being alone. When I looked back, I didn't see a dramatic transformation. I saw a quiet return. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no clear finish line I could point to and say, this is where I became strong. What I saw instead were small shifts that added up over time. Fewer fears, softer reactions, longer pauses before I spoke, a steadiness that didn't need to announce itself. I noticed how silence no longer scared me. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt spacious. There were mornings when I woke up without urgency, without the familiar pressure to fill the day with meaning. I would sit by the window, watching light move slowly across the room, and feel present in a way I never had before. I wasn't waiting for something to start. I was already here. Being alone had once felt like proof that something was missing, that I had failed to build the kind of life people admired, that I had been left behind. Now it felt like the opposite. Alone became the place where I recovered pieces of myself I didn't realize I had lost. My patience, my clarity, my ability to listen without planning my next response, my comfort with uncertainty. I didn't need constant connection to feel whole anymore. I needed honesty. I understood then that solitude wasn't something I had to escape. It was something I had to learn. Learn how to stay. Learn how to breathe inside. Learn how to hear myself without judgment. There was a strength in that kind of presence, not the loud strength of achievement or recognition, but the grounded strength of knowing where I stood even when no one else was around. My life became slower, but it didn't shrink. It became simpler, but it didn't lose meaning. I stopped measuring my days by how busy they looked and started noticing how they felt. Some days were quiet. Some days were repetitive. Some days passed without anything worth sharing. And yet, I felt deeply connected to them. I realized that peace doesn't come from filling space. It comes from respecting it. There was no longer a need to prove anything. I didn't need to explain my choices or defend my pace. I wasn't hiding anymore, and I wasn't performing. I was just living. Being alone gave me back my autonomy. My thoughts felt like my own again, not shaped by expectations or noise. My emotions moved freely, without needing permission or validation. I trusted myself more. That trust changed everything. When challenges appeared, I didn't rush to distract myself or look outward for answers. I stayed with the discomfort. I listened. I responded instead of reacting. I felt capable in a quiet way. The world didn't change around me. I changed inside it. I still had moments of doubt. I still felt fear from time to time. But those feelings no longer controlled my decisions. They came and went like weather, not warnings. I understood that being alone wasn't a retreat. It was a foundation. From that foundation, I could choose connection without desperation. I could engage without losing myself. I could be present without fear of abandonment. Solitude didn't make me distant. it made me whole. One evening, I sat in the same quiet space where this journey had begun. The room felt familiar, but I felt different inside it. There was no tension in my chest, no urge to escape the silence. I listened to the quiet and realized something important. I wasn't alone in the way I once feared. I was with myself, and that presence was enough. I thought about all the time I had spent running from this stillness, filling it with noise, people, distractions, anything that kept me from hearing my own voice. Now that voice was calm. It didn't demand, it didn't criticize. It simply spoke when needed and rested when it didn't. That was strength. Not the kind that pushes forward at all costs, the kind that knows when to stay. I didn't lose myself when I was alone. I finally met myself. And in that meeting, I found something I had been searching for without knowing its name. Peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind that stays even when everything else is quiet. As the night settled in, I turned off the lights and sat with the darkness without fear. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like rest. I didn't need to rush toward tomorrow. I didn't need to go anywhere else to feel complete. I had found strength in being alone. And for the first time, I trusted that it would stay with me wherever I went.